Okay, well, thanks everybody for coming again. Unfortunately, this is our last in a series, so I'm going to try to do a little bit of a summary to begin with, and then we're going to launch into the continuation of where we left off last week. And I've got some information tonight that I want to share with you that man, if I can only explain to you in an appropriate way, and that's what I was praying for. This information is unbelievable. It's revelatory, and I just hope that I'm able to impart it to you in an understandable way so that it penetrates your heart and your mind, because it is literally amazing. I couldn't believe it when I received it myself, because I've been searching for the absolute truth, the absolute truth of what is life all about, what controls life, where does life come from, what generates life. Once life is created, what is operational in life, what are the controlling factors in life, what caused life to forge onward, who created life, where was it created, all of these kinds of issues that every single human will come to question in their own mind. And that brings us to the first point again, and I started the whole series out that first night with the fact that the human brain, the human organism, is a living organism created by God to develop a relationship with God. We're to love God, and God is to love us. It's a two-way street. And I became totally convinced very early on in dealing with mankind that the brain is a technological organ. And I said last time, you are not your brain. And that's important that you get that concept. It sounds so simple, but it's so vital to understand that you are not your brain. Your brain is a technological instrument that God created to run you through. You are outside of your brain. And the brain is an organ that God created to make sense out of the universe, to make sense out of life. Life is a puzzle. The universe is a puzzle. And our brain wants to put this puzzle together. And when we can't put this puzzle together, our brain becomes distressed. And when the brain is distressed, it causes stress in the human body. And stress causes 95% of all human misery. All human disease, 95%, is associated with stress in the body. And it's so simple that until this puzzle gets completely put together and our carnal brain can make sense out of this, we are in a state of disease. We're in a state of distress in some way, shape, or form, some state of dis-ease. And that can go all the way from being uneasy or anxious to developing schizophrenia, post-traumatic stress disorder, chronic depression, chronic anxiety, cancer, rheumatoid arthritis, Crohn's disease. Any of those maladies of life can come from a state of dis-ease that our brain perceives. It all emanates with that information center. And that center is there to manage information. And I've used this along the way to show you the way that God imparts information to man is through our DNA. This is DNA. And you can see it's got wheels on it. It's a carrier of information. And you can see that it has information in the form of those letters. Those letters are genes. And those genes can be lined up in a multitude of ways. And you can also see that this DNA has an actual sound to it. It has music. And that's literal. This molecule of DNA literally has music to it. That every single one of us are a musical instrument through which God is trying to play his symphony. And we all have our part to play in that symphony. And we want to keep this instrument as well tuned as possible, and in order to do that, we have to understand how it works. So that's what we're in the process of doing, understanding how it works. So another way of looking at DNA is this board. And you can see this magnetic board by itself is really nothing. But the DNA board carries information. And you can see there's scattered letters and scattered numbers on here. And science discovered this in 1953, that DNA was the molecule that carried the information for life. And this is the information. And it's totally random. But what science discovered was that in the process of looking at this molecule, that all of these letters and numbers weren't just randomly thrown on this molecule. As they looked at it, they began to realize, hey, wait a minute, those letters all line up to say something. There's an intelligible word that's being carried on this board. There are intelligible numbers that are being carried on this board, and there's meaning and purpose built in to this information. And it was thought, like my biochemistry textbook in medical school said, biochemical predeterminism. It was thought that the molecules automatically, because of the chemical structure of the molecules, they all lined up with F being first, A being next, M-I-L-Y to spell family. That was all based on molecular structure. And it didn't take science very long to realize that, wait a minute, that doesn't hold water. That doesn't work. The molecular structure of family doesn't make these letters line up like that. So if that's not inherent in the molecules that make up those letters, well, then it must mean that there is a force outside of the molecule that lines this all up so that it makes sense. And then science began to realize that, hey, there must be a mind out here in this universe. And that mind is orchestrating these numbers and letters to mean something. And you know who that mind is that science is talking about. It's the mind of God that arranges all of this. So without the mind of God arranging this, then it's just a bunch of scattered letters and numbers. That's fascinating, and it's interesting chemistry, but it doesn't mean anything about life. Life only occurs from order and from structure and from meaning and from purpose. And that's what this mind creates. The other fascinating thing that is just beginning to be realized now is that, and for 400 years, science has failed to recognize this. And we've been told that when we get our molecule, everything is lined up like this, and we have no control over this. But we know now that we not only have this phenomenal mind working for us in the universe, but we can literally change the order if we want to. In a state of disease, this order gets fouled up. And in that state of disease, if we had no control over it, then we would be diseased forever. It would be fouled up. It would be meaningless. We know now that the forces generated by our faith, the forces generated by our spirit, looking at it from a physics standpoint, the forces generated by the quantum physics and quantum mechanics of electromagnetic forces from our thoughts, emotions, and our feelings literally can reform this information. So we can take a state of disease and turn it back into a state of ease by reordering the letters on the DNA. And we can do that by our faith, by what we believe. It's what we believe that generates the force and the creativity that realigns this structure. It's been estimated that there are over 30,000 ways that every single one of our genes can be expressed in the human body. That means we have 30,000 different options for every single gene. We have 22,000 genes in the human genome. Of those 22,000 genes, each one can be expressed in 30,000 different ways. And those 30,000 different ways are based on our thoughts, our emotions, and our feelings to a great extent. That's what they live with day in and day out, is our thoughts, our feelings, and our emotions. Well, who has control over our thoughts, feeling, and emotions? We do. So we ultimately have control over the structure of our DNA. We literally have that physical control. On a cellular level, going back down to the more simplistic form of the cellular level, the cell is operated, this is a cell wall, and the cell wall has these molecular structures on it, and these structures will either let life into or out of the cell based on whether they're open or whether they're closed, and they open and close by information that comes down through this molecular protein antenna, and that antenna picks up receptors from the environment. These are chemicals from the environment. These chemicals come in from the environment, they attach to the receptor sends a message through the antenna down to the gate opens or closes to let life in or out. We can saturate our receptors with molecules of stress and anxiety and stress and resentment and jealousy and anger, and those are all yellow, orange, purple, and blue, or blue is the fruits of the Spirit. So if our receptors are surrounded by the molecules of love, joy, peace, patience, and kindness, and all of the fruits of the Spirit, it tells these channels to open up and let life in. If these molecules are of the stress variety, it tells these channels to stay closed, and it keeps life from coming into the cell. So again, even down on the simple cellular level, we've seen how DNA has that information. Now we'll go one step further to the cell, and the cell has that same capacity of reading information and transmitting information. So in the end, we're the ones that have control over these molecules that operate the vitality of our cells. So if this cell becomes sick and this cell becomes broken, and cells break, and cells become diseased, and cells become broken, the information to fix this is contained in the DNA, but whether to fix it or not comes from the state of ease or disease that the cell is in. And if the cell is in a healthy state, it can generate its fixing potential, and the cell can become fixed and it's operational again. Again, we have control over that. Just to take one step back and look at the DNA structure, and this is a literal structure of the double helix of DNA, and it's amazing to me finding out. I love the chemistry of DNA, but until recently had no idea what was really going on inside the DNA other than the genes. You know, the genes are lined up that tell us how to make these proteins in our cells. That's been studied for the last, since 1953, when DNA was first discovered. But now it's becoming realized that this molecule is a crystalline structure, and this molecule, because of the vibratory frequency of these molecules of hydrogen and oxygen and nucleic acids and bases, those molecules contain a vibratory frequency. They emit a sound. You can literally, we have an instrumentation today, can actually pick up the sound emitted by the DNA molecule. And your DNA molecules sound different than my DNA molecules. And if you put this DNA molecule under stress, it compresses itself and it changes the sound. Just like if you change the tension on a guitar string, and the sound changes. So our sound changes. And our sound can either be coherent with God's sound, and if it's coherent with God's sound on the same frequency as God's sound for us, then that sound can come in and it's received by our DNA, and God can help us regulate our DNA and literally change our DNA. Not only is it a molecule that has a resonating sound to it, it also produces photons, which is what light is. So the DNA molecule is both sound and light. Think back to the origin of the universe that we went over the first night. When the universe was first formed, what did God do? He spoke life into the universe. So he injected sound into the universe. Then what did he do? He created light. Sound and light are the basis of the universe. Sound and light are the basis of information in DNA. Each one of us have our own sound and light frequency in our DNA. Remember the week that I spent talking about the new receptors that have been discovered on the human cell. These receptors are called self receptors, S-E-L-F, self. Each one of us as selves have our own frequency. And God, even before God created us, as it says in Psalms and in Jeremiah, God knew of us before he even created us. When he spoke into the universe, he spoke your creation and my creation into the universe along with everything else that he created. He injected it into the universe. It was a done deal. You were going to be formed. And we have cells that pick up that information. There are cells that actually pick up information through antennas, just like this TV-looking antenna. It picks up the vibratory frequency from out here in the spiritual kingdom, and that has as much, if not more, to do with the regulation of our cells as the molecules do. So these receptors are not only sensitive to the molecules, but they're also sensitive to the vibratory frequency that they get from outside of ourselves, who is God, and inside of ourselves, God, when he injects us into the universe, when we are formed, he injects that information into our DNA. We carry that from the moment we're conceived. We carry God's information in us as to who we are. If we didn't carry that information in us, where would our yearnings come from? Did you ever think about, everybody has yearnings. Where do those yearnings emanate from? You know, if you have no source for a yearning, what are you yearning for? There is no yearning. That yearning comes from the fact that God implants those yearnings into the knowledge of us, into our DNA molecule. And those yearnings come out, and they're what drive us to seek out and find God. It's a yearning that we have to have that loving interpersonal relationship with God and with others as well. You know, when I was trying to really understand this thing about the vibratory frequency of molecules, you're going to wonder, what in the world are you doing? I was reading about the scientific investigations of how fruit flies live in order to extract how I live. Fruit flies live by the molecular structure in their environment. So here's a molecular structure of a smell. It's an odor in the environment. Now we know that if a fruit fly smells this molecule, he's going to react one way. If he smells this molecule, he's going to react another way. You can see the difference between the molecules, right? They're nowhere near similar. This is one molecule, and this is another molecule. And science and me and everybody else has thought, well, what determines that is the three-dimensional structure of this molecule. That's what determines the message contained in this molecule. So messages are contained in three-dimensional structures. Well, a bright scientist was able to take this molecule that made a fruit fly into a certain direction, and he changed one hydrogen ion. And these white balls on this molecule are hydrogen ions. He changed one hydrogen ion, which had nothing to do with changing the three-dimensional structure of this molecule, and he presented that new molecule to the fruit flies, and they flew in exactly opposite direction. Not because the three-dimensional structure of the molecule changed, but because that one hydrogen ion changed. And remember when I gave you the talk on my hydrogen hypothesis, and that is that that's how God created man. We can change our molecular structure just by changing one hydrogen atom, one hydrogen ion, one hydrogen atom. A hydrogen atom is made up of a proton and an electron, and we know that our thoughts can affect electrons. So just thinking, we can change the molecular structure of a molecule without even changing its three-dimensional structure. And as proven by the fruit fly, it gives an entirely different message just by changing one hydrogen. We were talking about changing one cell in the body leading to changing 100 trillion cells in the body. All you have to do is change one hydrogen molecule and you can change the body. So that's the process of information transfer. So now we'll take a look at, okay, so we've got all this information, And this information is coming in, and how is that information managed within the human organism? Because we're not just a cell. We have a device that goes between us and every one of these cells, and that device is the human brain. The human brain is a receiver of information. Well, who controls how that brain is structured and function? Do we have any control over how that brain is structured and functioned? So to look at that, the question is, do we have free will? Did God instill free will into man when he created the universe? And there's a lot of people that think that he didn't, and that we are a product of, a passive product of our genes, and we can't change genes. Well, I've already showed you we can change our genes. Now, let's go to the human brain. The human brain has a structure to it made up of brain cells, and those brain cells are these little particles that are floating around in this water. And you see how rapidly those particles settle out to the bottom? They don't stay in suspension very long. And in order to build a network of thinking, feeling, and emotions, these nerve cells have to form partnerships. They have to form neural networks, neurological networks. Those are nerves coming together and forming synapses. That's how the brain is structured, like that net on that board that I've constructed there with the basketball net. So if those cells all settle out quickly like that, well, then the brain tissue is devoid of any nerve cells. You're not going to get much activity out of that part of your brain. But in God's kindness, he created the brain so that when we focus our attention, when we put our focus of attention onto a certain area of our brain, if we focus our attention on hatred and anger and resentment, or if we're walking around with self-deprecating thoughts of guilt and shame, then that's where the focus of our attention is. We can walk around feeling and thinking miserable, then we're putting our focus of attention on our misery. If we think about our misery, that changes the density of our brain to Karo syrup. And you see how Karo syrup holds those nerves in suspension so that they're more likely to set up a neurological network. And once that network is set up, that becomes the controlling factor in our life. That's the way God made it. He made it so we can choose how we structure our brain. So not only do we have the capability of structuring our DNA, we have the capacity to structure our cells. We also have the capacity to structure our brains. We can choose to think about what we're thinking about. And when we think about something, by putting our focus of attention on it, we change the density of it. And when it's dense like this Karo syrup, the cells can form a neurological network. So that neurological network is going to form into this netting. And as we grow and develop, the neurological network, if it's traumatized, will form a hole in it by the stresses and strains induced by the trauma to our brain. And once that trauma occurs, the question is, can we do anything about it? And that's going to disrupt the nerves, the neurological network. These holes in the brain are going to disrupt that. But if we put our focus of attention on this neurological network and begin to fill this hole with the fruits of the Spirit, which are love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, faithfulness, and self-control, we literally rewire our brain by putting our focus of attention on it, and that neurological hole in our brain gets filled with the fruits of the Spirit. And there we've got a functional brain. Well, it's up to us to choose whether we refill this hole in with the fruits of the Spirit, which is the blue cord, or whether we fill the hole in with the negative cord, which is where we focus our attention on resentment and jealousy and hostility. We choose that. And if we have accomplished filling that hole in with this type of function, we can always remove this cord by taking attention off of it, where it turns back to water and it'll dissolve. And then when it dissolves, then we fill it back in with the blue cord. And then that becomes the motivating factor for our existence. Okay, So on the diagram that you got in front of you, replicated up here on the board, you can see one thing, this is information coming into the brain, and these are the different areas of the brain that receive and handle this information. Information coming into the brain first comes into the brainstem, which is the lower part of the brain, the part of the brain that's associated with regulating heart rate, blood pressure, our body temperature, all the regulatory mechanisms that keep us alive, keep us surviving. Then that information gets a coloration put on it, and it's put up into the limbic area, the emotional area of the brain. And of course, the soul is contained within this limbic area of the brain. And the limbic area of the brain is where the emotional flavor is put on our actions and our thoughts. And all emotion, there's a tendency to think, since emotion is such a viper pit, that all emotion is bad. But my goodness, can you imagine not being able to feel the emotion of love? I mean, the same brain that generates the emotion of love also generates the emotion of hate. And if you took the emotional center out of the brain, you'd not only remove hate, but you'd also remove love. Anybody willing to give that up? So we have to learn how to moderate our emotions, not extinguish our emotions. Once there's an emotional flavor, this is all subconscious. These two parts of the brain operate under our level of consciousness. Our thoughts, which are managed in our prefrontal cortex, the highest level of our brain. This is where God deals with man primarily, is in our prefrontal cortex, that highest structure of the brain. And this is where our analytical decision-making, meaning-making, process-making goes on in our brain. So that's kind of the flow of information once it gets into the brain. But where does the information come from that comes into our brain to express ourselves? Well, here's the list of how information comes into the brain. First of all, it comes into the brain from the spiritual kingdom in the form of our authentic self. That's the message, that's the Diane show, or the Vernon show, or the Adelaide show, or the Judy show. There's a show for everybody that's out here in the universe, in the spiritual kingdom. The Linda show. Out here in the spiritual kingdom, your show is out there waiting to be played. But it has to have a brain to play itself through. So this information is out there. That's your authentic self. Your authentic self is contained in two areas. One, in the authentic self that God injected before your creation. And then he also put that same amount of information into your DNA, which is contained in your entire body. So he put that information in two different areas. And the greatest position to be in life is when we're playing our show, our authentic self, we're living our authentic self through our body and brain, just as God intended for us, who is out here, as well as the information he put within us and our DNA. They're in total coherence. That's when total peace and tranquility and communion with God occurs. That's bringing us back to the state that Adam was in total communications with God. So here's the authentic self as a source of information. God himself is out here with all kinds of information and wills to happen for our life and for every circumstance and situation. We also have Satan, the adversary. He's out here vying for this instrument. He wants to play this instrument, not as bad as God does, but he's out there wanting to vie for real estate in this brain so that he can steal, kill, and destroy us. Our body is trying to get our brain's attention because it has developed a series of habits, addictions, urges, aches, and pains, and most of these are coming from, as you said, Sheila, that's coming from what we see, what we've been raised with, our patterns of behavior that we've incorporated from our families and from our environment. Then we have our memory, and in our memory we have both an explicit memory, which is our recallable memory, and we have an implicit memory. That's the memory that we don't recall. And as you may recall, when I was talking about memory a few weeks ago, the implicit memory is formed in the first 3 years of our life. Almost every memory we have in the first 3 years of our life is implicit. In other words, if you think about what you were doing when you were 2.5 years old, most of the time you can't remember that. Some people can, but most people can't. Some people can measure down to about 24 months, but not much below that. But the explicit memory begins to be formed between 3 and 8 years of age, and 85% of our memory is downloaded by the time we're 8 years of age. So that's another source of information that's coming in from our brain. And this information is coming from inside the body. That's coming from our emotional center of the brain. The last factor of information that comes into the brain comes from the world, the outside world, comes from our environment. It comes from our families, it comes from our friends, it comes from the literal environment that we live in, whether it's hot, whether it's cold, whether it's friendly, whether it's unfriendly, whether it's loving, whether it's hateful. That's what sets our environment. So these are the 6 sources of information that come into the human brain to cause us to have a thought. The source of thought is totally unconscious. To a great extent, it can be conscious, but you can choose what you want to think about. But that doesn't come until further down the line, as you'll see in this progression here. Look at the top of your page, the source of thoughts, and we said that 60 to 70,000 thoughts run through the human brain every day. 60 to 70,000 thoughts every day. And science shows that 90% of those thoughts are replicas of the day before. So when you live in your thought life on Monday, 90% of your Tuesday has already been lived on Monday. You're just reliving it on Tuesday. And it continues on through life until we become knowledgeable of the fact that we can control our thoughts. It doesn't have to be that way. That's just the way it is because we're passive. We haven't been told this. We've had that taken away from us by the world and science, ill-advisedly. So we don't have control over the source of our thoughts. Those thoughts will come in. And this is very important to understand this because I don't have to go any further than looking at myself, but I've said before, I have wondered how in the world can my brain have some of the vile thoughts that come into it. And if I begin to associate my person, myself, with my thoughts, well then when I have a vile thought, that means I'm a vile person. See, a lot of people live their life concluding that, and they live miserable lives as a result of it. And it's just not true. It's not true. When you can have a thought of murder, suicide, robbery, adultery, I mean, you can have a thought of any of those thoughts, and if it comes into your mind, you're not responsible. God doesn't hold you responsible for it because most of those self-deprecating thoughts are all coming from the adversary. He's out to steal, kill, and destroy. So the initial thought is uncontrolled. The brain as an instrument is wide open to obtain information, but that thought can either be a deception from the adversary or it can be of an advocate form from a godly form. Now, the next step, the brain, once it has a thought, then it has the capacity to grab a hold of that thought through the focus of our attention. And since I ruined my attention by dropping it on the carpeting, I can't show you attention. Unless somebody's got a gallon of Carol syrup. But we are the ones that grab a hold of that thought by taking our water brains and turning it into Carol syrup brains through the focus of our attention. That's a conscious effort. We consciously are aware of our thought at this point in time, and this is where God begins to hold us accountable for that. That so many people, especially Christians, I find non-Christians have very little difficulty grasping, dealing with their thoughts, because they don't give a hoot about good, bad, or indifferent. But once you become a Christian, you begin to think, well, if I have this bad thought, well, then I'm a bad person, then God doesn't love me, he's going to throw me away, and my life is over. I mean, it's easy to conclude that if you're an absolutist, and most of us in this room are absolutists. That's part of our personality. We absolutely believe that. Churches and religion teach that. If you have a miserable thought, you can be sitting in church and have a fantasy of some kind that is derogatory or sinful and condemn yourself all the way to hell in a brief period of time. And you're not responsible for that thought unless you grab a hold of it and allow it to gain the focus of your attention through the implementation of your conscious brain, which goes on up here. Then you become responsible for it. So this idea of religion casting this false guilt on Christian followers just hurts me to no end. There are a lot of religions that make people feel so guilty they need to be rehabilitated, to know that their authentic self has nothing to do with who they think they are. They just think that because they've been taught wrong, they've been told wrong, they've been ministered to wrongly, that you can't control this down here. But this is where we begin to seize control, if we're aware that we have the capacity to. But if we think that we're in control of this down here, that thought never gets here, because in order to get here, to seize our attention, the awareness and the attention center in the brain is located up here. If you think that your thoughts, derogatory as they might be and sinful as they might be, are your fault, guess what? That keeps that whole process below this line right here. It keeps you living out of your limbic area and out of your brainstem, and this is the area of stress dominance. It keeps you living in a state of stress. Functional MRI scans literally show that these kinds of condemning thoughts prevent blood flow to the front part of the brain. So you don't even get blood supply to that part of the brain. How could you use it appropriately? You can't. And you go on condemning yourself because that thought continues to stay here, and you continue to ruminate over it, you continue to rehearse it, you continue to form a habit over it, you form an addiction over it, and before you know it, it's got you completely defeated, and Satan has created stealing, destroying, and deceiving you. And that's what we're out to stop. So when our conscious level takes over and we focus our attention on the trueness, the authenticity and the source of that thought, then we can use this area of our brain, and this area of the brain counteracts anything that goes on in these two areas of the brain. This is the command and control center. This is where God resides, up here. And he has control over these things if we ask him to help us control these things. So when we grab attention to this thought, we can either passively continue to entertain the thought, which takes us right down the road to sin, or we can actively grab a hold of that thought, and we can say, hey, wait a minute, that thought has got no business in my life. I'm going to veto that. I'm not going to put any attention to it. I'm going to divert my attention to something else, and that something else is what my DNA is trying to tell me, which is my authentic self, and what God is trying to tell me from outside of me. So you've got somebody coming from outside. You've got God outside telling you who you are. You've got God inside telling you who you are. And all you have to do is realize the source of those informations and listen to him, because he's trying to tell you who you are. But as long as you believe that you're something less than that, you'll continue down this road. So this vetoing the attention, the sin becomes aborted. And that's how we command control of our nature. Because we all have this nature. We've always got a positive side and a negative side, and there's a constant battle between those two sides. But we can contain that and we can control that, because the more you use either one of these arrows, whichever one you use the most gets the strongest, just like a muscle. If you exercise this day in and day out, this muscle gets big and you become godly. You exercise this because you think you're defeated to begin with, and Satan becomes the stronger muscle in your brain, and he takes over, and you are stolen, you're destroyed, and you're killed, and you're admonished for the rest of your life. And it all boils back down to where you chose to put the focus of your attention. So if you look on your sheet, I don't have this portion on this diagram up here, but if you look on your handout, it says, where it says the active veto by directing your attention, I have a big how with 2 question marks after it. How do you do that? Well, you do that by exerting your conscious attention, grabbing a hold of that thought, and with an attitude of joy and praise, gratitude and expectation. We know that the human heart becomes coherent with God when it comes from a foundation of gratitude and expecting the best. When your heart, and meaning your spiritual heart, when your spiritual heart is in a state of gratitude and expectation, you're going to expect the best before it's ever happened. You're already expecting it. You know, so I use the example, rather than praying for rain, you know, if you're in a drought, the most effective prayer is not to pray for rain. Did you realize that? The most effective prayer is to pray like it's raining right now on top of your head, and you're sensing the rain. You're living in that expectation. That literally changes the physiology of your heart. It does. It changes the electromagnetic physiology of your heart, and it brings it into coherence with God, because God will have it rain. So when you approach this with that, you've already loaded your guns to the hilt. And then the steps to overcoming that deceptive thought, you know, science doesn't call these things sin, they call them deceptive thoughts, but that's okay, I can understand that language. But it's sin to us, and that deceptive thought, you grab a hold of it and you take authority over it. And the handout I gave last week, entitled The Battle Plan, I'll just hold it up just to show you, remind you. This is the handout that I had of the battle plan, and each one of these steps has a number of scriptures. I mean, I didn't make this stuff up. In fact, I didn't get it out of a science book either. I got it out of the Bible. And the scriptural evidence for each one of these steps is right here on this battle plan. God gave us this information. He loves us, and he wants to take command of it. So each one of these steps go all the way down to the point where you literally revalue yourself after being devalued by some derogatory, deceptive thought. And the way we refocus our attention is to focus on the Word and to focus on our position, that position that Christ gave us. He already established it 2,000 years ago, and that's the position of faith, righteousness. Then once we establish that attention is focused on that, then we revalue ourselves, and the way we revalue ourselves is to look to the Word and remind ourselves of who we are in Christ, not who we are in this flesh. Because who we are in this flesh is not really who we are. This is just the dressing that we're wearing. It's like our brain. Our body is also not us. All I have to do is look in the mirror and thank the Lord that it's not me. I've got so many wrinkles and 56 inches of scars and 7 spine operations and 2 heart operations. I've been split from end to end. But that's not me. That's this living organism that God's been trying to play his message through, and in the process, I've been dead and brought back to life again, because he wasn't through. So we can take authority over our thoughts. We can accomplish that through this process, and realize that we need to get our thoughts up into this area of our brain in order to take command of them, because this is where the focus is. As long as we live in this area of the brain, we're defeated, because we run by our emotions. And emotions will kill any endeavor. Our personal endeavors, our group endeavors. It's amazing to me how Satan has done a number on the human brain. Satan has biased the human brain. It's amazing to see the studies well, they've even done it with athletic teams. They'll take a Broncos fan and they'll put him in a functional MRI scan, and then they'll show him a picture of a Green Bay Packer uniform. I'm serious. Do you know how long it takes that brain to shift all of its blood into this emotional, violent center of the brain when that happens? Less than 1 second. I'm serious. It wasn't. I don't think it was the Bronco and the Packer. It was a football team. You don't have to think about being angry. If you just hold a picture of someone's face who is angry in front of a human brain, do you know how long it takes before that brain reacts to it by forming a biasness about that anger look on that person's face? This will shock you. It's not only less than 1 second. Studies show that it occurs before the picture is even shown to you. Now, this means that the human brain is capable of responding to an event before it even consciously knows the event is coming. They've done studies where they have taken angry faces and they've taken people's brains and functional MRI scans and say out of 50 pictures of a face, say 4 of those pictures are anger. And they shuffle the cards up or they shuffle the pictures up and they just randomly start showing these pictures. So the experimenters don't even know when that angry face is going to come up. But 6 seconds before the angry face shows up, people are able to change their heart rate, change their blood pressure, change the blood flow into the limbic area of their brain to respond to that angry face before they even see the face. That means that this is called, at the fear of being called a heretic, extrasensory perception. How do we do that? Our heart tells us that. Our heart brain tells us that. Our brain works by what it can see, what it can smell, taste, hear, and feel. But our heart brain responds to vibratory information in the spiritual kingdom, supersedes our senses. That's how sensitive this instrument is that God has made for us. But it's also how Satan, because everything God made, Satan has tried to pervert it, how he can pervert that, and pervert it by showing us angry faces all day, and we respond to it in that way. But another essential thing that we have to keep in mind as Christians, because the human brain is also biased. I've been doing some studies over the last couple years on group dynamics. I went to the University of Wisconsin, and during the Vietnam War, one of the most tumultuous campuses in the country at that time was the University of Wisconsin, I hate to say. My brother was a Marine in Vietnam, and I wasn't involved in it. But I was walking across the campus one day. We had the National Guard on the campus for a whole year during my senior year of college to keep all these radicals out of the classrooms. I wanted to go to school because I wanted to go to medical school. But anyway, I was walking across the campus. What I'm trying to say is I'm the least likely person to get involved in a riot. I had absolutely no time for that. I mean, I was working and I was studying and I had my plate full. So I was walking across the campus, and there's a big statue of Abraham Lincoln in front of the Hallmark building on the University of Wisconsin campus. It's called Bascom Hall. And there must have been 500,000, 600,000 people gathered around Bascom Hall, and they were chanting, board it up, shut it down, board it up, shut it down, board it up, shut it down, board it up, shut it down. And I was trying to weave my way through that crowd to get to my molecular biology class. Well, I got trapped in the middle of this crowd. And you know what, my first thought was, I got to run out of this thing. This is driving me crazy. My class is coming up. And you know, it didn't take about 10 minutes of me standing in that group, and I started chanting the exact same thing. No, the human brain is susceptible to group dynamics. And as Christians, we become groupies. And the human brain is biased, guess what, to protect the group. And you know how much hostility there is in the world today against Christians. And a lot of that is because as a group, we begin to think through our biased brain that everybody else is wrong. Well, if you think that, you're wrong. Everybody else isn't wrong. I mean, a lot of this information that I'm telling you about now, a lot of this information came from the Bible, but a lot of it came from people that don't know God any more than a man in the moon. But that doesn't mean you throw the information out. You take the truth out of every single area, and you integrate it with the truth of the Scripture. Anything that violates Scripture, you throw it out. But a lot of Christians, I think, have gotten this rap, and to a certain extent, it's because our brain is biased in this way, and we haven't been told that it's biased in this way. So our little group isn't the premier group on planet Earth. So we have to be mindful of that. And this biasness of the brain coming from our emotional center goes for athletic teams, it goes for race, it goes for gender, it goes for all of these things. There's all kinds of studies that show if you're a Christian, every single fact of evidence that comes before your mind, you will filter that through a Christian perspective. And your first impression is, if it goes against Christianity, it's wrong. It's wrong. Just that fast. Your brain says, it's wrong. Well, maybe it isn't. take time to allow it, because when you're saying that, you're talking out of this part of your brain. Let that information get up here, where you can analyze it and evaluate it and make an adequate assessment of it, and then determine if it's wrong or not. Put it up against the Word, and if it doesn't jibe with the Word, then it's wrong. But see, our biasness keeps us from that. Those kinds of features to know about the brain are helpful to keep us out of hot water and to keep us loving and kind human beings, because we cut people off so quickly and make judgments so quickly. And it's because of the biasness of our brain, and that goes back to the fall. Remember that one week I said, the simple fact of the fall, that you can boil all the fall down to one thing, and that's when man became judgmental. When we began to judge, that's when we began to die. And we began to judge when we ate of the tree of good and evil. That's the first time that we were able to distinguish between good and evil. Before that, Adam and Eve had no knowledge of good and evil. They were living in total tranquility, just like my brain boards over there. All their lights were blue, they were turned on by God. There's no red lights on over there because those are things from Satan. So that's the way Adam and Eve lived. And that's what we want to get back to, that same state of tranquility and communication, coherence with God, so that he can use us as the creators that we're meant to be. The other thing that happens when we're in this part of our brain, and this is part of being in this part of the brain, is that this part of the brain only thinks about one person. Do you know who it is? Who? Yeah. Totally selfish. Totally self. That's all this part of the brain thinks. And when humanity lives in this part, you may be put in this, you may be living out of this part of your brain, or somebody may be living out of this part of their brain, and they may not have started out being selfish. They may have been started out feeling guilty, or feeling resentful, or having some other self-deprecating thought about themselves, and that has caused them to live out of this area of the brain, and as a secondary effect of that, they have become the most selfish, self-centered SOBs on planet Earth. And that's what happens when you live in this part of the brain. That's the way the brain is structured. That's what Satan has done to it. So we've got to get out of that part of our brain. And in the next hour, I'm going to talk about how that God has put, these are just recent discoveries, God has put an area of the brain here and here that go between the limbic area and our prefrontal cortex, called the anterior cingulate and the insula. And these areas right here are what moderate whether or not we allow emotional information to affect our behavior or not affect our thoughts and behavior. And they've even done experimental studies at the University of Pennsylvania that show in the neuroscience lab that people that practice prayer on a regular basis and have a concept of a benevolent, loving God, their anterior cingulate actually increases in size when that's what you believe. So they can actually put a person under a functional MRI scanner 1 month and have that person be a marginal prayer or a marginal believer, and they can put that person through a process of 6 months of mind renewal, bring them back, put them underneath the functional MRI scanner, and because they have been feeding this part of their brain with God food, this part of the brain literally increases in size. So we have that capacity. Okay, well, let's just take a brief interlude here and be right back. Thank you.